Look at an old artillery piece in a museum and you may find the motto on its barrel, Ultima ratio regis, the last argument of kings. Artillery has taken pride of place in conflict. It causes the most casualties and destruction and is worthy of respect. One of the lessons of war is that artillery still matters, especially with millions of rounds in stock. So join me, Jan Darasz, for how we got here.
Catapults, trebuchets and ballistas. Various types of artillery have been a vital element of military landscapes for centuries. With the invention of gunpowder, the development of armaments led to the creation of artillery shells, the 155mm round among them. The French were the first to develop the 155mm cartridge in response to extensive trench operations during World War I. Throughout the course of the conflict, the 155mm became the most common artillery weapon used by the Allies, with the US Army later adopting it as the standard heavy field artillery. For World War II, the US Army produced its own version of the 155mm, the M1. Following the end of the war, the newly created NATO adopted the 155mm as its artillery standard. For the purposes of the Korean War, the cartridge was again modified, adding a cluster variant. It contained 88 shells, which were scattered over a large area to destroy vehicles, equipment and personnel. The 155mm howitzer round is one of the most sought-after munitions of the war in Ukraine. The United States has already sent over 1.5 million pieces of the artillery ammunition to Ukraine, yet Kyiv is still looking for more. 155mm shells can be customized in multiple ways. They can be filled with explosives and are able to pierce armor. They can also be used with precision guidance systems or initiate high fragmentation. The 155mm cartridge is so popular because it provides a good balance between range and warhead size. Fire from howitzers can hit targets from 24 to 32 kilometers away, depending on the type of projectile and firing system used, which makes them highly valued by ground forces for eliminating enemy targets from a safe distance. In Ukraine, 155mm ammunition is fired at a rate of 6,000 to 8,000 per day by the defensive troops. They are challenged by an estimated 40,000 missiles a day fired at them from Russian howitzers. As Ukraine prepares for an intensive counter-offensive this spring, it is estimated its forces will probably have to fire between 7,000 and 9,155mm shells a day.
Well, I'm joined today by Damian Radka, the Senior Analyst and Senior Editor at the Defence 24. So welcome to the programme.
Hello.
We're going to start off our discussion about artillery and its role and its evolution by just concentrating on one thing. The first question, the 155mm round. Ukraine wants as much as it can to get the millions of these rounds of ammunition. It's a NATO standard. Why is it so wanted, demanded, and why is it so effective?
Well, primary reason is because it's NATO standard. So NATO mostly do not produce Soviet calibers, 152, 122. The 155 is NATO standard for heavy gun artillery. And Ukraine can only right now procure or receive as a military help self-propelled and towed howitzers or gun howitzers from NATO countries. And all these systems are using 155mm caliber. Obviously, there are some NATO countries like Poland that were in the Warsaw Pact in the past and have a technology and production lines for the Soviet calibers, but slowly, because decisions were made several years ago that we are completely moving away from the old Soviet weapon systems. So the most investment was done in the production of the NATO standard ammunition. Another reason is that because NATO invested a lot in not only or not primarily in the number of artillery systems, but mostly increasing their quality, their effectiveness, their range. So on average, the NATO 155 millimeter artillery systems have greater range than the Soviet systems. And also, because of the quality of ammunition, the effectiveness of ammunition is much greater. There are stories from Ukrainian soldiers or foreign soldiers or volunteers that fight in Ukraine. They say often that, for example, Soviet-type artillery that is hitting near their positions, this ammunition is not always lethal. It is dangerous, obviously, if there will be direct hit, but near hit might not be lethal.
So it's a higher quality of
yes.
round.
In the same situation, the NATO round will probably kill them. Obviously, there is a wide variety of types of 155 millimeter ammunition, and also there is a plenty of manufacturers, not only within the NATO. For example, Republic of Korea produced the ammunition at caliber. Japan, India. There are producers in Israel, in many countries around the globe. So it is easier to procure that type of ammunition than only rely on the Soviet types of calibers.
You mentioned the procurement of these ammunition rounds, the ammunition stocks. When you look at the figures from, say, 1815, Battle of Waterloo, 42,000, around 42,000 were fired by both sides. A year later, in the Battle of Verdun, there were 60 million over 10 months. We need to be talking about millions and millions of rounds of ammunition, of this particular type of ammunition. Is Europe prepared for that, to think about these figures?
At the moment, absolutely not. Because of the
Why not?
peace dividend, Europe pretty much not only liquidated its own spare stocks of weapon systems, ammunition, even industry was reduced a lot. So Europe do not have a production capabilities yet. Obviously, if the politicians will stay on that course that is right now, perhaps someday these industrial capabilities to produce that ammunition will return to Europe.
And how long does that process take?
Several years, maybe even decade or more. Because we need to understand one thing. Building up industry is very difficult and very expensive, and it takes a lot of time. Destroying industry is very simple and very quick. For example, if we want to build a factory, we need to order machines that are used to build other machines and ammunition. So from the moment we order that machine to receiving it at the factory and installing it, preparing it to start work and produce the end product that we want, it takes on average around 2 to 3 years. However, we need to also understand that right now there is a huge demand. So the manufacturers of these production machines might on themselves not have enough production capabilities to meet that demand. So it increases the waiting time before the factory will start to produce the end product even more. So these are the problems of Europe. Obviously, United States is a different story within NATO because United States, due to its policy, due to its agreements with non-NATO countries, the United States are the world policemen. So they needed to keep that production capabilities on much higher level than Europe after the Cold War. And even United States, keeping these production capabilities on much higher level, reduced their capabilities and their stocks compared to what they have in the 1989, 1990.
Yeah. You mentioned, as we were talking before the discussion, about the Russian ways of circumventing these arms, conventional arms control treaties. President Duda signed us out of this treaty the other week. What were these ingenious ways that Russia was able to maintain its high stock levels, armament levels, and meanwhile, during the same period of time, Europe was exploiting this peace dividend, as you said?
Russia used its geography. So they moved a lot of weapon systems, a lot of these stocks behind Ural Mountains. So this is the Asia.
So it's outside Europe.
Yeah, so conventional arms treaty for Europe was not concerned with what is happening in Asia. This was the first method. Second method was that they moved some weapon systems and ammunition stocks from the regular army and move it into, for example, internal troops. So internal troops have armored divisions. Who would need armored divisions in internal troops forces? They moved some of that equipment into the Navy. Navy had tanks. Naval infantry, to be more specific. That was under the naval command. So they used these tricks to keep their capabilities in offensive, defensive warfare. They kept their industrial capabilities. Of course, they are not like during the Soviet times. A lot of these armament stocks went away. For example, some weapon systems remained in Ukraine, some in Belarus, some in Kazakhstan, etc., etc. So all the former Soviet republics also inherited some of that equipment. But Russia still kept majority of these stocks, and they kept industrial capabilities. These industrial capabilities are reduced compared to Soviet times, as I told. However, because Russia was not concerned with human rights, so they sold their weapon systems to everyone that had money to pay for that. And because these weapon systems were cheap, so they have a lot of customers.
Ammunition, yeah. Let's take a wider look at the perspective of from the perspective of the evolution of artillery. What would you say are the main milestones in the evolution of this particular weapon system? We've got starting at invention of the gunpowder, the black powder. How would you describe these milestones into the 21st century?
First milestone that concerns us was the invention of the self-propelled artillery. Because self-propelled artillery have a much greater mobility, it can provide a greater support for the mobile forces, especially the armor force, so tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, etc. Second invention was fire control systems that increased precision, decreased the number of rounds that are needed to destroy a single target, and also increased, or rather decreased the time that is needed to prepare firing solution, and in the end delivering the rounds on the target. This is very important for artillery. It's time. So the shorter is the time that artillery mission can be accomplished, the better it is for the fighting force on the front line and for the artillery itself, because the quicker we can do it, the greater survivability of the artillery system it is.
Yes, I mean, would it not be cheaper to have 100,000 cheap drones instead of 100,000 artillery rounds?
Yes, it will be cheaper, but a single kamikaze drone most often use attached RPG grenade. So this is a simple, lightweight, low penetration anti-tank grenade. It must be lightweight because these drones have a limited payload. So if you want, for example, to destroy a bunker with the command stuff inside it, such a drone will not work. We need heavy artillery, so either gun artillery or rocket artillery with a high payload of explosives, penetration warheads, that kind of ammunition types. So drones right now are a fashion. And when the ways to mitigate them will proliferate in the armies, that fashion will go away. This doesn't mean that the drones will not be used. They are useful, for example, for reconnaissance primarily. But the conventional systems like artillery, tanks, etc., they are still needed and will be needed. And you ask about the trench warfare, that it looks like the First World War. It looks like that because both sides do not have enough of modern tanks and other modern armored fighting vehicles. They do not have enough of artillery. And what is most important, they do not have superiority in air. Because if they, for example, if Ukrainians would have a superiority in air, they could simply bomb strongholds, trenches with large bombs that will completely destroy them. And creating such paths with first bombardments and then artillery bombardments, and in the last phase, the ground forces that are prepared to breach defenses, they could probably have a breakthrough, and maybe their counteroffensive would succeed.
Right. So still, as the Russians say, this artillery is still the god of war.
Yes, exactly. If we, for example, look at the calculations, on average, 70% of losses on both sides are due to artillery fire.
Yes. Okay, Damian Radka, thank you very much for coming onto the programme. It's a fascinating conversation about what really matters in war, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all we've got time for today, so join us again on How We Got Here.